afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicholas Hirsch. I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer in Ottawa, Canada, and I have the pleasure of chairing the second session of the Sochika Final Conference. I'm joined by 4 guest speakers today. I'll briefly introduce you to them. The first is Ornella Ordituro. Ornella studied the Italian asylum system and worked with refugees from the Western Balkan route in Trieste, and has a strong commitment in defending human rights since she started her career in foreign affairs and international cooperation as a humanitarian worker in Cameroon, Brazil, and Palestine. In May, she finished her PhD in international law at the University of Campania, Luigi Vanvitelli, Department of Political Science, Jean Monnet. I'd also like to introduce you to Willemijn van Kempen. She is 59 years, schooled and active as a physical therapist and sculptor, and identifies as a queer woman of trans origin and more. She is involved in emancipation of trans identities in the Netherlands since 2011, with activities ranging from grassroots self-help support to organization, LGBTI board membership, advocacy, also through arts projects, and the regional support for trans asylum seekers has led to the current research together with Alejandra, who is sitting next to her. So Ms. Alejandra Ortiz is a trans woman coming from poverty, violence, sex work, drug use, stigma, and illegal displacement to the USA. She fled Mexico after a life of violence and transphobia to the Netherlands, but was denied asylum. Nevertheless, she invests all survival skills and talents to improve herself, as well as the life of transgender individuals. And our last speaker is Mara Biancamano. She is an immigration and refugees, children and transgender rights lawyer. She has legal responsibility over the Antinu Arsigay Napoli, which is an organization that supports and promotes LGBT rights. She's also a volunteer in Migra Antinu, in a special desk for LGBT migrants. And furthermore, she works for Cipriomi Arci. Hopefully I'm pronouncing this right. I took Italian many years ago. She works for the Cipriomi Arci in Napoli, which is a government accommodation system for refugees. I'd also like to express gratitude to our facilitator, Mr. Martin Guerin Conwo Siangen. He is currently an engineering MSc student at the University of Wolverhampton and is an activist and leading member of Out and Proud African LGBTI, a London-based LGBTI asylum support group. So before we get to the first speaker, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. And for that reason, if you do have questions, we do ask you to use the Q&A chat box on Zoom. Once all 4 presenters have finished, we will turn off the recording and we will go through any questions you may have with the panelists. Each panelist will speak for approximately 15 minutes, and that way we have enough room for questions. So I'll start with Mara Biancamano. She is going to be presenting on sexual orientation and gender identity, immigration and reception from the Italian perspective. Take it away, Mara. Oh, you have to, here, I'll unmute you. There you go.
Okay, good evening to all. I will speak in Italian, I'm sorry, so Aurora can translate for me because the time is not so long, so it's preferred, I prefer to speak in Italian, I'm sorry. Allora, come detto nell'introduzione, sono un avvocato che fa di migrazione in generale e particolarmente mi occupo ormai già da qualche anno di migranti richiedenti asilo LGBT. Sono una volontaria, io sono la responsabile giuridico di Arcigay Napoli, che appunto, come detto, è un'associazione che si occupa in generale dei diritti delle persone LGBT, e abbiamo uno sportello ormai dal 2014 che si occupa dei migranti richiedenti asilo LGBT. Le problematiche generali che abbiamo riscontrato in tutti questi anni. Adesso farò una panoramica, diciamo, generale, per poi andare più nello specifico a riferirvi quelle che sono invece le problematiche più importanti. La cosa che innanzitutto voglio dire è che in Italia mancano delle strutture che accolgono i richiedenti asilo LGBT. Ve n'è solo una in Italia che è gestita dal MIT, il Movimento di Identità Transessuale a Bologna, e che ha soltanto 4 posti per appunto i richiedenti asilo LGBT, per cui la problematica fondamentale è quella di aiutare e gestire i richiedenti asilo quando non hanno delle strutture dedicate, ma si trovano a convivere con altri soggetti e magari si ritrovano a rivivere situazioni di discriminazione o anche di persecuzione ad opera degli altri soggetti, degli altri ospiti di questi centri di accoglienza.
So welcome everyone. As I was introduced by Nicola, in general, I'm an immigration lawyer, but for the past years, I have specialized as a migrants and asylum seekers caregiver, especially when it comes to LGBTQ plus migrants and asylum seekers in the territory of Napoli. As of now, I'm the legal officer and legal responsible for ACIGA here in Napoli, which is a national organization which is dedicated to the protection and advocacy for LGBTQ plus individuals in Italy. And here in Napoli, we are holding a migrants desk that is specifically addresses the needs of LGBTQ plus asylum seekers and responders. What I want to give you during this session is a general and brief overview of the situation in Italy, to then delve into the specific problematics that we've encountered in Napoli. What I want to start with is the peculiar case of Italy for when it comes to reception centers that can specifically address the needs for protection of LGBTQ plus asylum seekers. As of now, on the entire Italian territory, there is only one structure specifically that is specifically involved with these with handling this situation, and it offers like four beds, in a total of 4 beds. So only 4 people in Italy can receive housing protection housing protection and reception specifically designed for the needs of sexual orientation persecuted people. This structure is in Bologna, so in northern Italy, and it is handled by the MIT, which is the acronym for the Transgender Independence Movement. And it helps with supporting and handling cases. We are in a situation where we need to support without having supporting infrastructures which are dedicated specifically for these to address these needs. Therefore, people who are seeking asylum on the grounds of being discriminated and persecuted can find themselves in the situation to live with others who might, with others in need, who might also reproduce these dynamics of discrimination and persecution.
Ok, quindi il nostro supporto attraverso lo sportello migrantino viene dato a quelle persone, ai richiedenti asilo, sono per il 95% dei casi tutti richiedenti asilo, che si rivolgono autonomamente allo sportello, anche se sono ospiti di centri di accoglienza, ma vengono a conoscenza di questo nostro sportello di aiuto grazie a internet oppure tramite passaparola con altri migranti. Capita che i ragazzi vengono indirizzati al nostro sportello anche grazie all'aiuto degli operatori che si trovano all'interno dei centri di accoglienza. Però in questo caso è molto difficile stabilire una connessione, perché alcune volte il ragazzo o la ragazza, anche se c'è da dire che c'è una percentuale molto alta di richiedenti asilo LGBT maschi, mentre per quanto riguarda le donne sono in un numero veramente esiguo. E, stavo dicendo che è molto difficile stabilire poi un rapporto a tre tra noi dello sportello, l'operatore del centro di accoglienza e il ragazzo, perché molto spesso non c'è una fiducia piena nei confronti dell'operatore dello sportello, perché si teme che possa svelare agli altri ospiti del centro di accoglienza il proprio orientamento o identità sessuale o identità di genere. Vabbè, non so se vuoi...
Okay. Through our migrant desk, we offer our support to LGBTQ plus asylum seekers, refugees. In the approximately 95% of the cases that we handle is people seeking asylum on the grounds of their sexual orientation or gender identity. They, like most of the time, they reach our desk autonomously, or through word of mouth, or through a specific internet search. But there's also cases where they were referred to by operators in the reception centers where they are hosted. In this case, we have had like some difficult experiences, in the sense that the difficulty in building, let's say, a three-way relationship between the asylum seekers, our operators, and the operators from the reception center, it builds up a great obstacle, in the sense that there's an evident lack of trust coming from the asylum seekers towards the operator, for the fact that they fear episodes of retaliation, or for their case, for their sexual orientation to be disclosed to the other guests in the reception center.
Ok, ecco perché sarebbe molto importante che ci fossero molti più posti disponibili per l'accoglienza delle persone LGBT. Però manca anche un punto fondamentale nella catena amministrativa, no? E burocratica, che dall'inizio è quasi come se non riconoscesse, forse è un'affermazione un po' troppo forte, però è come se quasi non riconoscesse la problematica LGBT per i richiedenti asilo, perché nel modulo che viene fatto compilare in questura al momento della formalizzazione della domanda di protezione internazionale, che qui in Italia è il modello C3, non so se per gli altri paesi è uguale. In questo format vengono poste alla persona le più disparate domande sulla propria vita dal momento della nascita, la composizione familiare, gli studi, la religione e tutto quanto il resto, ma manca qualsiasi accenno al proprio orientamento sessuale, identità di genere, per cui viene totalmente tralasciato questo aspetto e tra l'altro si fanno delle domande specifiche se la persona è sposata o non è sposata, se ha dei figli, omettendo di porre l'attenzione su persone che magari abbiano una modalità diversa di vita e appunto l'orientamento sessuale differente, perché se è maschio viene chiesto hai la moglie, se è femmina viene chiesto hai il marito, per cui è difficile anche intercettare le persone LGBT nel momento in cui viene formalizzata la domanda di protezione internazionale. In alcuni casi, quando le persone si rivolgono a noi allo sportello, prima ancora di formalizzare la domanda di protezione internazionale, è molto più semplice perché queste persone vengono accompagnate agli sportelli della questura con delle memorie preparate da noi in cui appunto si fa un breve excursus sulla vita della persona con riferimento appunto alla identità di genere o all'orientamento sessuale e contestualmente si fa una panoramica anche sulla legislazione e sulla legislazione del paese di provenienza e anche sul sentimento sociale del paese riguardo a questi temi.
So what we've said, what I've just said, let the necessity to have more hosting spaces for more specifically dedicated hosting spaces even more urgent, because there's in general there's a lack of representation that also emerges in the, let's say, the bureaucratic chain that is behind an asylum claim. For example, I can. It may be a strong declaration of what I'm about to say, but there's almost this feeling that there is no recognition for the problematics that invest LGBTQ+ asylum seekers. I can speaking from the Italian case, I can say that when a person is interviewed at the frontier and wants to seek asylum, wants to place an asylum claim, they need to file a form which we call C3. And the C3 form is rife with personal questions that which delve into the studies of a person, their family, their religion, their political affiliation, and but nothing. There is no specific mention of their sexual orientation or gender identity. There's also many questions regarding their civil status and eventual presence of children, and without any recognition for an eventual different, let's say, modality of life, whether they do have a companion but they do not have a spouse, and The lack of a specific section makes it even more difficult to intercept LGBT people once they are once they're actually filing a request for international protection. In case they come to our desk, we proceed with handling their case and bringing them to the court with a complete overview of their memories, which is let's say an excursus, like an entire feeling about their lives, making specific mention of their sexual orientation and or gender identity. And furthermore, making specific mention of the legislation in the country of origin, which might criminalize sexuality or gender identity. And even stronger than that, a specific mention to the social sentiment that that looks at a different the panoramic of sexual orientations and or gender identities in different ways.
Ecco perché poi mi ricollego da questo punto di vista, mi ricollego ancora di più alla necessità che abbiamo riscontrato di avere delle persone che si occupano dei richiedenti asilo che abbiano delle specifiche competenze soprattutto appunto in materia di migranti LGBT. Questo non avviene, non abbiamo trovato una specifica preparazione né nelle sedi delle questure, quindi degli uffici immigrazione dove vengono presentate le domande di protezione internazionale, né all'interno delle commissioni dove ci sono dei funzionari che non hanno minimamente idea di come approcciare con un richiedente asilo LGBT. E la stessa cosa l'abbiamo riscontrata anche all'interno dei tribunali, dove tutto viene demandato alla buona volontà del soggetto intervistatore di farsi una preparazione anche in tema di persone LGBT. Abbiamo tentato più volte, nello specifico con la Commissione di Napoli, di creare una collaborazione, una linea di collaborazione, una convenzione che potesse offrire da parte di Arcigay Antino un supporto, una consulenza proprio nelle tematiche LGBT, anche fornire nostri mediatori e nostri operatori nel caso in cui la commissione si dovesse trovare a valutare le domande di persone LGBT. Ad ora non ci siamo ancora riusciti, però l'obiettivo che ci siamo prefissati nel medio futuro è proprio quello di stringere assolutamente un accordo, una convenzione con la Commissione per i richiedenti asilo. Per quanto riguarda invece il Tribunale di Napoli, c'è stata una richiesta specifica che abbiamo rivolto al Presidente della sezione che si occupa di immigrazione, la sezione specializzata in diritto dell'immigrazione, ma la Presidente di sezione ha rinviato a noi come comitato appunto di responsabilizzarci sul rilascio delle tessere ai ragazzi richiedenti asilo che si presentano al nostro sportello per avere la tessera di Arcigay. Poi vi spiegherò perché insomma c'è questo è molto importante questo elemento.
So what I've just said, let's emerge even further the necessity to have people who have a specific competencies with LGBTQ plus asylum seekers. But as of now, we haven't found a single person who has these characteristics in the institutional spaces that we visit and that we enter, the spaces where we accompany people trying to seek, claim for asylum. I'm talking, we haven't found it in the police headquarters, in the migration offices, nor in the commissions, which are, here are the offices where the personal story of a person is listened to judge whether they're fit for international protection or not. And especially in the commissions, we have found operators and deputies who have no idea how to handle the specifics of encountering an LGBTQ plus asylum seeker. Nor have we found it in courts, where actually it's all brought on the goodwill of the interviewee to autonomously get prepared and get educated on these thematics. As Arcigay, we have made numerous attempts at creating a line of collaboration with the courts and these institutional spaces. As of now, we haven't so far made it. What we want to do is to offer consulting spaces and consulting time, to also render available our operators and linguistic and cultural mediators. Our aim, our specific goal in the medium to long run is to create this sort of collaboration, especially with the commissions, which is especially important in the case of someone directly listening to the story of someone seeking for international protection. When it comes to the court, instead, we have made a specific request to the tribunal in Napoli, and especially to the office dedicated to immigration rights. But the president of this division has expressly said that it's up to us as Arcigay to be more responsible in the way we accept members into our association. The membership card is actually an element that will become more relevant in the next part.
Sì, perché praticamente in passato l'appartenenza come socio ad un'associazione di tutela delle persone LGBT e nello specifico all'Associazione Nazionale Arcigay costituiva per alcuni tribunali, ha costituito per qualche tempo per alcuni tribunali la prova della omosessualità in sede sia di commissione che appunto anche di tribunali, per cui il membro di un'associazione LGBT automaticamente veniva considerato come una persona LGBT. Ovviamente tutto questo non corrisponde alla realtà, perché nello specifico Arcigay non è un'associazione solo per persone LGBT, ha come scopo quello di tutelare i diritti delle persone LGBT, ma è aperta a chiunque voglia iscriversi, quindi anche alle persone eterosessuali. L'anno scorso c'è stato uno scandalo, nello specifico a Roma, perché è venuto fuori che alcune associazioni concedevano la tessera alle persone che si presentavano presso lo sportello con la specifica con lo specifico intento di far dichiarare queste persone omosessuali, e soprattutto per alcuni ragazzi che provenivano da specifici paesi come ad esempio il Gambia, questo perché in Gambia o anche altri paesi dove appunto l'omosessualità era considerata reato, e quindi alcuni richiedenti asilo che si erano allontanati dal proprio paese per motivazioni prettamente economiche e che si erano ritrovati poi a presentare la domanda di protezione internazionale non avendo una storia personale che rispecchiasse qualcuno degli elementi caratteristici per il riconoscimento della protezione internazionale, a questi soggetti veniva consigliato di dichiararsi omosessuali per ottenere una forma di protezione internazionale. Ovviamente tutto questo è venuto fuori e adesso le associazioni LGBT in generale vengono considerate come una sorta di anche purtroppo dai giudici come una sorta di associazioni che pur di salvare anche un solo migrante, anche se non omosessuale, viene concessa la tessera. Anche in questo caso la realtà non corrisponde a quanto viene comunemente ultimamente affermato, perché nel momento in cui, almeno io parlo per il lavoro svolto dal nostro sportello, nel momento in cui un ragazzo o una ragazza si presenta al nostro sportello per essere seguito e per richiedere la tessera, viene spiegato loro che la tessera di membro di un comitato come quello Antino Arcigay in Napoli non costituisce assolutamente prova di omosessualità, ma che anzi proprio ultimamente viene considerato come un elemento invece negativo. Invece noi cerchiamo per ogni ragazzo che si presenta allo sportello di introdurlo in tutte le attività che in generale il comitato mette in campo, che può essere il gruppo giovani, può essere le lezioni di italiano, la partecipazione ad eventi e manifestazioni, e per coloro che lo richiedono vi è un supporto anche psicologico. È chiaro che anche nel momento in cui viene dato questo supporto psicologico e la persona fa varie sedute con il nostro psicologo volontario, alla fine cerchiamo di dare all'interlocutore, che può essere la commissione o il giudice, una relazione, un report finale che è diciamo fatto in sinergia tra i vari operatori, quindi l'operatore legale, il mediatore e lo psicologo. In nessuna delle nostre relazioni viene comunque detto come affermazione chiara e precisa che la persona è o meno omosessuale, ma vengono riportati tutti quegli elementi che secondo la valutazione soprattutto dello psicologo possano far ritenere che abbia subito traumi psicologici e talvolta anche fisici dovuti al proprio orientamento sessuale o alla propria identità di genere.
Sorry to interrupt. We are getting a bit over time, so if you can just provide some concluding remarks so we can move on to the other three speakers.
delle conclusioni.
Sì, le conclusioni, poi volevo dare un ultimo punto e poi mi fermo perché poi volevo anche confrontarmi successivamente, magari nella seconda parte, con gli altri presenti sulle modalità che magari loro hanno di accoglienza e di supporto delle persone LGBT. Un'altra problematica fondamentale riguarda il riconoscimento del tipo di protezione a chi viene ritenuto omosessuale. Molto spesso ci è capitato che sia le commissioni che i tribunali non riconoscono lo status di rifugiato, che è la forma di protezione più adeguata per le discriminazioni basate sull'orientamento sessuale, ma si riconoscono o la protezione sussidiaria o addirittura per il passato la protezione umanitaria. E anche facendo gli appelli poi alle corti di appello abbiamo riscontrato che c'è un senso, cioè come se non si volesse riconoscere il più alto grado di protezione accordata per le persone LGBT. Quindi la mia conclusione è che in Italia si dovrebbe fare molto di più per la preparazione delle persone che sono deputate ad avere a che fare con le persone LGBT e una protezione proprio specifica fatta dalle associazioni che operano in questo campo.
So just for information, do you want me to only translate the concluding remarks or make a brief overview of what Mara said before?
I think if you don't mind just summarizing her points before and then interpreting the conclusion. I just want to make sure we have time for questions if there are any.
Yeah. So basically the membership card issue comes from the fact that at some point there was this feeling that, this information that being an association committed towards the protection of LGBTQ plus individuals, if the membership to Acigay and to other associations was an automatic proof of homosexuality. Since the Italian case is really interesting in the sense that there is a lot of weight on the story of a person to be credible in court to obtain protection. There were some associations which were pushing people to declare that they were homosexuals or to take part to be present into these associations. To avoid these kind of discriminatory treatment, which has seriously hurt the credibility of the associations, Acigay in itself encourages people to also take part in the activities that we hold, coming from like Italian classes or the Cineforum movement. And in general, we also make a full report on the specific cases that we encounter, and it's coming from the talks, private talks between that the claimer has with our psychologists or with our mediators and the legal operators. And we want to, we never make any specific reference to sexual, to eventual sexual orientation, but mostly to the eventual trauma, whether physical or psychological, that emerges, and that might be related to persecution and discrimination. So as closing remarks, what I would really like to discuss with my peers is the eventual types of protection that are granted in their countries. I can say that many courts deny the refugee status, which ought to be the highest level of protection granted in the European territory, choosing to eventually grant lower levels of protection, which either last less or cover for less. So in a way, it really protects less or grant less rights, especially the rights of movement on the European territory. And just to quickly wrap up, what I believe is that in Italy, especially, there needs to be much more preparation and education on the deputy officers that then specifically handle the bureaucratic process of asylum seeking, especially when it comes to LGBTQ+ protection. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. Grazie per questa presentazione. So our next speaker is Ornella Ordituro, and she's going to speak on asylum seekers and their status as refugees or as beneficiaries of international protection, the Italian perspective.
Oh, thank you. Last year has marked the highest worldwide level of migration ever recorded by the UN Refugee Agency so far. However, the want to migrate is an asymmetric right. The possibility to each individual to leave the country of origin does not correspond to a parallel duty of reception by the state of a destination. Although political asylum is currently universally based on the right of asylum provided by Article 14 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights of 1948, the Asylum Institute remains a concession of its state. Article 10, paragraph 3 of the 1937 Italian Constitution confirms this point. A foreigner who in their home country is denied the actual exercise of the democratic freedoms guaranteed by the Italian Constitution should be entitled to the right of asylum under the condition established by law. This is a form of asylum commonly accepted in international law, which has a wider scope than traditional asylum. It refers not only to the right of asylum guaranteed to refugees, but also includes the entry and permanents who are victims of persecution by undemocratic governments. Nonetheless, the references to the condition established by law makes it clear how it should be exercised in accordance with national rules. The right of asylum is the right of foreigners to enter in the territory of the Italian state in order to claim asylum. Take into account the fact that it's not easy to distinguish incoming flows in relation to the reason that led people to migrate. This paper examines the Italian approach in granting asylum seekers refugee status or in recognizing them as beneficiaries of international protection. The 1951 Refugee Convention relating to the status of refugee is ruled by Article 1 of Legge Martelli and by the President of the Republic's decree of 1990. This is the first time that the expression political asylum has appeared in the Italian regulatory system, and the clause of geographical and temporal limitation was abolished to the 1967 protocol relating to the status of refugee. Nevertheless, the refugee issue has remained a marginal aspect on the Italian political agenda. Then, the general lines of public immigration policies were established by Law Number 40 of 1998, Legge Turco-Napolitano, which intervenes both in the field of immigration and reception, as well as regulates the integration of asylum seekers and refugees in Italy. The Testo Unico, this extremely complex regulation, deals with permit of entry, work, integration, territorial control, expulsion of strangers, and international cooperation. In particular, the legislator wanted to implement a policy of a lawful, limited, planned, and regularity entry. The law has formally introduced a new protection for humanitarian reasons, including the residence permit for social reasons to protect the survivors of slavery and exploitation. Further changes to the protection system introduced in 2002 by Legge Bossi-Fini simplify the procedures for the recognition of refugee status, which in the event of a negative answer provide the re-examination of the case by the administrative authority, with the possibility of jurisdictional appeal even after repatriation. The law also provided measures aimed at contrasting and suppressing illegal immigration without discerning the personal conditions from the irregularity of the situation. Between 2004 and 2011, the most important legislative reform on asylum was adopted. I mean, the directive of the European Parliament of the Council number 83 of 2004 on standard for qualification of third country national or stateless person as beneficiary of international protection for a union status for refugee or for person eligible for subsidiary protection, and for the content of the protection granting, and the directive of 2011, the recast. A person eligible for subsidiary protection means a third country national or stateless person who does not qualify as a refugee, but in respect to whom substantial grounds have been shown that believing that the person concerned, if returned to their country of origin, in the case of a stateless person to their country of former habitual residence, will face a real risk of suffering serious harm. Most recently, in 2017, the Decree Ministro Orlando has introduced provisions aimed at accelerating procedures. In this case, asylum seekers could not only submit one application, could only submit one application for international protection at the Territorial Commission of References, which examines the requirements for the recognition of refugee status as an alternative the subsidiary protection, or eventually the humanitarian protection. The law has also supported the judicial structure to the institution of many specialized sections and speeded up the time of procedures relating to the request for international protection in case of refusal by the Territorial Commission. Protection for humanitarian reasons is provided by Article 5, Paragraph 6 of the Testo Unico of the Italian law for serious humanitarian reasons or resulting from constitutional or international obligation of the Italian state. The resident permit for humanitarian reasons was an integral part of the pluralistic system of international protection which can be ascribed to different situations. For example, particular vulnerability of the applicant, such as the tension of precarious psycho or physical condition or serious pathology not adequately treated in the country of origin. In the exceptional case in which the subsidiary protection provided by the qualification decree could not be recognized, whether the applicant could be exposed to dangerous situation in the event of of repatriation, the presence of a serious natural disaster or condition of extreme poverty in the country of origin or to vulnerable people. The recent reform applied by the security decree or Decreto Salvini adopted in 2008 has introduced several and significant changes to the legislation enforced by abolishing that humanitarian protection scheme. The Article 5, Paragraph 6 of the Testo Unico and Article 13, Paragraph 1 of the regulation containing the implementing rules of the Testo Unico have been replaced by cases of residence permit only for medical treatment, calamity, acts of particular civil value, and special protection, such as domestic violence or exploitation of labor. On the one hand, the legislator has reduced the high number of residence permits issued for humanitarian reasons. On the other, it has reduced the discretion in granting humanitarian protection by territorial commissions and courts. This decree has sparked interest, and many scholars have wondered if the security decree still recognizes those causes of humanitarian needs. Some argues that the reform provides a greater certainty to domestic law, covering a balance between international and constitutional asylum obligation. The legislator repealed humanitarian protection as a general category, replacing it with an exhaustive list of grounds for protection aimed to circumstances to circumscribe the residual hypothesis already regulated. On the other hand, scholars debate that the humanitarian protection has been one of the main forms of asylum implementation. The permit had been granted to those who had delicate situation, health situation, maternity, minors, difficult personal stories, vulnerable people, up to being one measure for integration. As analyzed for this paper, despite the efforts to interpret the status of various forms of protection in order to safeguard people in need of international protection, the UN sent a note to Italy affirming that the implementation of new standards introduced to limit the scope of humanitarian protection assessment may be difficult and create situations of uncertainty and potential inequality of treatment. As examined, the Italian legal system for the protection of foreigners has undergone a significant compression over the years. The humanitarian protection need to be separated from the two hypotheses of international or subsidiary protection. Indeed, it was a residual, atypical nature and with no standard assumption. It has been provided for generic and broad protection in case of serious reason, in particular of humanitarian reason, or resulting for constitutional or international obligation of the Italian state, when the condition for recognize the refugee status or subsidiary protection to the seekers do not exist or don't appear. It was a resident permit for those not qualifying for refugee status or subsidiary protection, but nonetheless deemed vulnerable enough to need protected. Notwithstanding these legislative developments, the Italian court, in its judgment number 2946C of 2019, barely ruled that the law should not be applied to requests for asylum submitted before the decree law entered into force. Asylum seekers who had been granted humanitarian protection before that day should therefore be entitled to stay through migrant receptions. The analysis of the registration made at courts of the appeals by the Territorial Commission for the Recognition of International Protection shows two results. First, the Territorial Commission do not always consider certain circumstances, although in some cases they were later clarified in the appeal. In particular, it is evident from the practice that all sexual orientation and gender identity asylum cases were then accepted and considered as refugee during the appeal. There are many stories of women and girls who fled from FGM or other cases of SOGI applicants. Furthermore, from the monitoring of the jurisprudence under examination, it emerged that international origin of asylum is not or considered with specific references to the 1951 Refugee Convention or to the International Convention of Human Rights. But there is substantial reading of domestic law that sometimes lead to a more restrictive interpretation, which does not take into account, for example, the UN interpretation guidelines on issue of persecution based on gender, sexual orientation, or exploitation. Finally, the jurisprudence of asylum remains a marginal element which could instead present a laboratory for reflection capable of enriching the legal culture in broader themes. Secondly, it is reported at a broader and more general level the difference from one commission to another or from one court to another are apparent, with some being more permissive and others more restrictive in the interpretation. However, it notes that these are not quantitative but qualitative considerations. The number of asylum seekers have difference from area to area. In conclusion, the discussion of the reduction of funds, of the lack of reception and integration of structure for applicants, which also occurred following the security decree, remains open. These cuts make it impossible to support the reception, including for first reception structures, and entail the reduction of services previously guaranteed to refugees, especially with regard to those activities intended to facilitate their integration, such as learning Italian, support to prepare the hearing at Territorial Commission for the request of asylum, professional training sports. There are also no generic assistance activities due to the evident lack of funds, especially for the staff. The data consulted on the material reception conditions of migrants, whether they are asylum seekers or beneficiary of protection, underline the difficult situation of the Italian system. The reported systemic shortcomings have already been highlighted by some national courts and those of EU member states that proceed to suspend some Dublin transfer to Italy for violation of fundamental human rights. The difficulties encountered by applicants in enjoying reception conditions, such as to guarantee the respect of their rights during the relative procedures and for the integration phase on the territory, raise many concerns also from the part of organizations engaged in the field. The latest reform mainly affects the most vulnerable migrants. Moreover, although the financial cuts do not concern all the reception phases, they prevent an intervention in support of economic and social inclusion. During the interviews, migrants have often declared that they feel a sense of despair because of the difficult prospect of future integration in Italy, since they have already left their country for years. In many cases, they feel as prisoners in Italy, and they will prefer to take part into the assisted voluntary return and reintegration program put in place by the UN rather than fail integration in Italy. The existence of an inadequate immigration and asylum system is increasingly used to try to aggravate the burden of the emergency situation, criminalizing migrants instead of prompting an inclusive and immigration and integration policy. I would like to express my solidarity to Patrick Zadie, who yesterday was named honorary citizen of the Italian city of Bologna. I would like to thank the Sogica team for inviting me at this beautiful conference. I would like to thank to the Territorial Commission and the Court of Trieste, as well as the Court of Milan, Rome, and Naples for providing me the documents. And thank you all of you for listening to my presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Ornella. Before we move on to the last panelist, I just want to remind everyone that if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box. And also, if your question is directed to a certain panelist, make sure you indicate their name in your question. Okay, with that said, we'll turn to our last presentation by Willemijn and Alejandra. And their presentation is entitled Transcribing the Margins, a community-based research examining trans-specificity in Dutch asylum procedure. Let me unmute you. Yep, you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Can you see our presentation? Okay. Thank you very much. Let me introduce myself again. My name is Alejandra, and next to me is Willemijn, and thank you for being here today. Willemijn and I are closely related to the research topic. We met in the asylum seekers housing facilities when Willemijn started connecting inside the facility to trans persons as a body and informing and listening and pushing for trans-specific healthcare issues nationally, and we developed a friendship. Unfortunately, after a draining, lengthy procedure, I was refused asylum. This left us both with many questions on the way asylum procedures are conducted when a trans person asks for international protection, especially since trans murders are higher in Latin America than other regions or than the general population, and sex work is the only way of income for 75% of the population. And there's an indication of a low life expectancy, some say 35 years, and with a high risk of HIV as well. We were in need of insight and answers, and we started informing ourselves, and we decided to invest this information on a way that would be useful for others. We were not sure, and we wanted to know if and how all these circumstances that contribute to our lives in the margins will be seen and understood in the asylum procedure. The lived experience and circumstances have become the focal point in this research to measure if and how they are seen and considered in this procedure. And now the next question. The central question is how and to what degree the circumstances of trans Latinas contribute to the danger and inability to live in the country of origin are represented and considered in the current Dutch asylum procedure. As you will hear today, there is certainly a need to transcribe the margins of mine and other trans persons in the asylum context for the purpose of a better adjudication of trans asylum procedures. Now, regarding the research scaffold, the questions we had became an explorative case study with a small number of 8 research participants and a high load of background research information related to the country of origin circumstances, including the asylum procedure documents, the many steps in the asylum procedure provided by the participants themselves, and semi-structured interviews with our 8 participants according to research standards and with ethical approval. The information was coded using software Atlas, and it was analyzed and supported by triangulation and of the overlap of the information to balance the analysis. We decided to focus only on the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that do not criminalize being LGBTQI, and countries that were not controlled by foreign powers. And the inclusion criteria was that the persons had to be trans-identifying from the Latin American Caribbean region, from a country of origin that does not criminalize being LGBT, older than 21 years old, and having applied for international protection due to their gender identity in the Netherlands. And the cases are not representative and not selected, and of the total group of the Latin American Caribbean region. All of them are transfeminine, between 25 and 40 years old. Transmasculine, non-binary, and non-heterosexual trans experiences are not represented in this research. And very important, we have to keep it as anonymous as possible to safeguard the safety of the people we interview, with the exception in some situations for Cuba, because at one point there were between 30 and 40 trans persons from Cuba here. Now, next point will be dealt by Willemijn.
Hello all, so I will continue here on the structure of the research. And the structure, we've got to keep in mind that it has a general part of baseline observations and the specific part where the experiences and the circumstances for trans people are observed as they were dealt with in the asylum procedure. And so we started with the hearings and look, is this theme addressed, that we know that it is in play? How is this theme questioned? What is left out? And after that, we looked at the assessment for the intentions and the decisions, what the arguments were used, how the teams were positioned, what was left out, and so on. So in this process, the experiences and the circumstances are the yardstick to measure the procedure. In considering these experiences and circumstances, we made a subdivision in 9 themes, as you can see on the slide, from prison conditions, legal gender recognition, and conditions of gender care, which are trans-specific, which are also great themes to consider if an asylum procedure is trans-specific, because they are only apply to trans people. And as you will see later, is that there is a lot of big problem with conflation and mix-up between LGBT and trans issues in the procedure in general, and it is a risk. So considering if it's trans-specific is very important. So then if we come to the results, again, we split these up in baseline observations and in the lived experience of circumstances when we will talk about these results. They are not representative for the whole group of LAC trans people. They are exploring a small amount of 8 cases. They are detailed in following through the procedure, and they are indicative of flaws and tendencies to attend to in asylum procedures in the future, as we hope. The richness and detailed observations has been compressed strongly, and sometimes therefore it becomes a listing, and we hope to avoid that a bit as far as we can inside the time frame. So if we first look at the baseline observations, then we see a lacking differentiation, and we see that in a mix-up of LGBT teams. And this is especially a problem that in the majority of trans people we saw, those 8 trans people, majority, they were mistakenly deemed to be protected by anti-discrimination for sexual orientation. That was not working for gender identity. And this is a serious omission, since it leads to an immigration service assuming that there is a protection possibility that is not present. And you have that the current guiding lines, they are totally adapted to LGBT asylum seekers. The questions are only pointing in examples to their situation. Trans people are classified as sexual identities, which leads to a risk to conflation. And there are no trans-specific questions, while there is a good practice alternative since 2011 in the form of a UK guidance, which is much more trans-specific than the current Dutch working guideline. Then another theme is that the execution of the credibility assessment of a trans identity, when we follow through this to the procedure, it turns out that half of the participants are approached as gay men. They are questioned about their romantic orientation towards men and their relationships, instead of to things that are relevant for a trans experience. The other half did receive questions, but these questions are not documented as to, they do not have a space in the guidelines. So they go further than the guideline itself. And then there is no limit to the intimate questions on surgery, which is a bit of a problem. We have a parallel thought about that, about sexual acts. There will be no questions, and that's an offside for the immigration service. But on the other hand, we question how it is possible that you can be asked such intimate questions without limitation in the asylum procedure. Then another problem is that the majority of participants is misgendered. They are simply approached as men while they are identifying as women. And how can they open up in an asylum procedure if their identity is not respected? And further on, holding on to the assigned sex is a risk to holding on to gender normative perception. And this, in its turn, is a risk to a biased adjudication of the asylum procedure. Then, on the other hand, the differentiation is very needed, because there is a large difference when you differentiate the LGBT and the T experience in severity. Trans people experience more exclusion, violence, and discrimination, are much more liable to cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, and they have less protections. As we have seen, they have less protections in the legal provisions for trans people, and they are not anti-discrimination is not applying to them, so they are less protected. And then what is problematic when documentation is needed is that there is only sparse information about this small group, and of course there is a lot of complaints in general by stakeholders on the accuracy on country of origin information, which we will also encounter later, which is a big problem. And the EASO, European Asylum Support Office, they follow this criticism on inaccurate COI, and they did provide a guideline to fix that, but they left out trans people because they thought they were not so common in asylum procedure. And that is problematic again, because this economy of numbers again will disenfranchise trans people in the asylum procedure. Okay, when we then come to the consideration if and how trans Latinos experiences and circumstances are represented and considered, our main findings are that there is a profound lack of trans-specificity, that the predominant use of general country of origin information in a superficial way does not fulfill the need to document these experiences and circumstances, and that it is totally not representing and considering the total. So yeah, that is the overall picture that returns over and again in a very large pile of separate observations. And especially if you don't see the total, you take out experiences and pieces, and you do not look at the causality and the structural nature of stuff, it looks like separate elements. Okay, so we go on, and then we see that we look first at the trans-specificity. And we see that regarding legal gender recognition, that most trans women were not legally recognized. Half of the participants had been imprisoned with men, and they actually faced physical and sexual violence from guards and prisoners. And it's a well-known risk described in the Yogyakarta principles, but during the whole procedure, it's not taken into account as a structural risk to a well-founded fear of persecution. Another thing is that protection is often not present, which is also left out in the fact that simply it is not considered that absence of legal gender recognition outlaws a trans person in very many situations. And that a lack of identification also leads to police stops incriminating trans people as having false identification, dressing up, leading to harassment and arrest and violence for their gender identity and expression that is not in accordance with that legitimation. So absence of trans rights in these three areas is a large problem. But there is a pervasive neglect. If you look at the hearing and people start, you know, in the asylum procedure, police violence will be questioned in a detailed way. And there you see a sequence of questions coming up from the asylum officer regarding police protection. And in that narrative, you often see that trans people will say that they had problems with the legitimation, but at no point the Immigration Service will turn their questioning to the absence of legal gender recognition. And afterwards, in the assessment, they will simply leave out any consideration on those legal provisions for trans people, which is very fundamental, I think. So, and what does this leaving this consideration regarding these trans-specific human rights do? It leaves out how the absence of it contributes to the severity of persecution and accumulation. And the absence of rights and provisions is a cause for and a contributor to a lot of hardships. It is structural and repetitive. It is also a government responsibility that is left out. And it also relates to all the ways that trans persons cannot claim government protection because of the absence of these rights. Okay, then we turn to the presence of specificity, the use and interpretation of country of origin information. Country of origin information is especially important because they are deemed credible. The direct criminalization is absent, and that means that a lot of considerations about the severity will be about is there a documentation to support this severity? It relates also to is everything in severity has been seen and addressed? Is protection from state authorities present? Can somebody relocate in the country? and are there risks upon return? So country of origin has a huge role to play, and especially with violence by state authorities towards trans Latinas' involvement in sex work and the instability and repression in countries of origins, which were three themes we run through the asylum procedure. Those three themes are important because they relate strongly to things like police protection. Well, what do we see then? We see a lot of omissions and unbalanced interpretations on country of origin information when we compare it to our background research information. And we see that in legislation and provisions, as we have said before. We see it in the background research information, and what you also see is that there is a reluctance in trans Latinas after police violence, which they practically all faced. And this relates to making it harder to claim protection at a police office. And this is all wiped away as if it's not important, whereas this fear and this distrust that has grown in trans people in the course of all their experiences makes it very explainable why there is this reluctance. So, and then another aspect of country of origin information that the Immigration Service at no point involves aspects of instability or repression in a country. And especially when you look at the NTCA countries, Northern Triangle of Central America, which are Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, it is well documented how trans people are part of the migrant caravan, how they are described in Women on the Run as people that cannot get protection, that are threatened by non-government groups as well as police groups who are sometimes cooperating with those gangs and who are corrupt and are a risk too, and it is not very helpful to try and complain with the police. So this is well documented. It is also said in the LGBT guidelines by the UNHCR, because this UNHCR says trans people are a group which you should pay attention to in this country because there might be a risk more even than the LGBT persons. So another aspect is the interpretations about sex work. If you would take a look at background research information, which also could be used as COI, then you would see that often sex work is a product of the marginalization of trans person at an early age. If you're kicked out of your house, if you're kicked out of school and you're landing on the street without a finished education, how will you get work? Being visible as a trans person. So the risk to be involved in sex work is very high. But if you follow the Immigration Service, they simply attribute all the violence that happens towards trans sex workers and to trans women who are perceived as being sex workers. They attribute all the violence by state authorities to sex work only. So they set aside all the ways that the trans identity produces this violence. They set aside the intertwined reality of those people, and they simply say, well, it is related to sex work, and sex work is a criminal offense. And so the end result is that the police violence against those trans women is less considered. And on the side, they also mistake the criminalization, because both in Cuba and in another country, trans women were not criminalized for soliciting, so they were wrongly informed, but used this information to incriminate trans women, where it was not a criminal offense at all. So, so it leaves us to thinking that COI is far from fulfilling its proposed function in the asylum procedure, And the use by the immigrant service is not transparent. It's overly general. It's not trans-specific. Little COI is mentioned in their intentions. It is not balanced, and the important aspects are not retraceable in the asylum procedure. Then we come to the third point, main finding, that is to see the total and its interactions. Because we see asylum procedure that is narrowing down its scope, and in its instructions it says, for instance, not all available information is relevant, and main and side issues must be distinguished, and the core of the asylum request must be identified. So I understand that the Immigration Service might not have days to listen, and that they would want to come to the core, but what we see now is that they always lean toward the larger isolated elements and the physical side, which simply means that a lot of detail and oversight and interplay between intersecting problems are left out, which also leads to a problem with accumulation. When knowing that the UNHCR's handbook has a paragraph 52 to 55 and 201, which clearly addresses the accumulation of problems that can amount to a well-founded fear of persecution, then all this information is important, because only then the accumulation will come to light. And that is a problem which we did not see. And what the themes that we addressed, you can see them on the slide, on early problems in childhood, and self-restriction, and the intersections. Well, if you look at early life, I already mentioned that being thrown out of your house and the education is very high risk to become involved in sex work, with 75% of more of trans Latinas in Latin America being involved. So, and I would also want to point to that this is not anymore about an individual. This means that someone is part of a social group, and this part of the social group is not addressed, even though the signs are very clear. If you have such a low life expectancy as a group, which sticks out from others, if you have this 75% of more involvement in sex work, can you then speak about an individual responsibility towards sex work? Yes or no? And we clearly conclude that the weight is way too much on the criminalization. Then on the self-restriction. Self-restriction is also an expression of severity. If you stop dressing as a female because you are afraid on the street and you only walk the street at night, or if you avoid going out, these are all signs of severity. Severity that is not looked at by the Immigration Service, though it is told in the hearings. Then the intersecting aspects, there are quite a few, but themes relating intersectionality, I will go through past a few. Singular positive examples. The Immigration Service used in half of the participants, they used an example of someone who succeeded in being in parliament or being a politician or whatever. But what this singular positive example did not tell, that it was contrary to the general and trans-specific COI on the severe problems in the country of origin. And if you compare it to the country of origin, you simply see an exception to the rule. And it's quite brutal to use an exception of the rule and ignore all the ways that it is an intersectional problem why people are caught up in sex work. Then there is an intersectional side to criminalization of sex work. So you have this trans identity, which binds up with the sex work, but after that, the criminalization is a separate part. And also in the criminalization, you could say that human rights organizations are quite aware that they simply constitute violence and offenses against trans people and sex workers in general. But this is not considered in this way. The Immigration Service takes the point that if it is If it is criminalized, then it must be wrong, and we do not have to consider it, which is very one-sided way to look at it. And then we come to the psychological impact. Somebody else mentioned it already, that fear and distrust can be a part of trans people's repertoire. And we see that psychological impact of all that happened to them shape their participants' behavior. And it may affect their ability negatively to represent and communicate the circumstances. And you see it in medical examinations before that their detailed memory, their emotional responses are different. They can downplay problems or neglect grave incidents when they are talking about it or making fun of it. They act in a casual, detached way. On the other hand, there are signs of a high impact and strong reactions like depression, agitation, disturbed sleep, anxiety they talk about. So that contradicts how casual they bring it. And then nearly all self-restricted avoidance of government officials is a big theme, and not trusting people and organizations. And all these elements, they slip into the asylum procedure as risks for not representing their own narratives in a good way. So that's also an aspect of concern.
Sorry, Willem, I don't mean to interrupt, but we are quite over time. If you could just provide some concluding remarks.
Yeah, I will come. I'm just coming to my point, and this point is that, and that's why we titled it "Like Sand Through the Fingers." It is as if those experiences and circumstances that you categorize and that are present in these lives, and that they slip through your fingers, and that only a little of this sand is left over in the hands to show what the problem is for those trans women. And I think that is the image that that still stays with us after this research. But we hope in the future that we can reach asylum authorities to talk about these issues and improve the asylum procedures for trans people, hopefully not only in the Netherlands, but throughout Europe. Thank you. Thank you for your attention and time.
Great, thank you so much, Willem and Alejandro. I know here in Canada, we do have some information on the general challenges for transgender newcomers and integrating, but really not a lot generally on the refugee status determination process as it relates to their identity. So I really appreciate your presentation.